Have you ever been waiting on God? Yeah. I've been there a lot. You know, the type of waiting that gets scary, where the waiting starts to hurt a little bit. The kind of waiting that starts to feel like maybe he abandoned you, or maybe he just isn't going to help this time. That's what I'm talking about today. And the title of my message is Yet. In those moments, it's so hard to know what to do. You can start to get angry or frustrated with God. You can get depressed or have anxiety. It's difficult to not get that way because your life is hanging in the balance. Trust me, I've been there. Sometimes it's your health. Sometimes it's your finances. For me, the most common was my mental health and how I felt about situations. I'd be going through an issue and it would get so bad that I'd eventually stop praying about the issue and start only praying about my mental health because of the issue. My prayers went from God, we need a new car, to God, I'm falling apart. I know I'm not alone in this house today because we're all human. Most of us have been there. There needs to be a name for that place where you stop praying for your issue and start praying for you. There's got to be a name for it, but we ain't came up with it yet. When we get to those places of desperation, it's challenging, so we start to get impatient. We say things like, well, I just got to do it on my own. I can't just sit around and wait. That'd be reckless. And if God's not going to answer, I guess I just need to make a choice myself. When the deadline is around the corner, we start fending for ourselves. Let's be honest, show of hands, who's been here in that place before where you start fending for yourself? You can't wait on God, so you take over. Well, let's look at Saul today and how that worked out for him. No spoiler alert, y'all Bible readers. Let me start with telling you the story of Saul. Saul had become king of Israel, but the times were difficult and they faced many enemies. In their culture, God's prophets were equal in reverence and power to the king. Saul had a prophet named Samuel who was appointed by God. King Saul's reign had reached a point where the enemies were closing in on them. A powerful enemy was on their doorstep. Fear began to spread, and even many soldiers began to scatter and flee. Before any battle, Samuel had been given clear instruction from God. Samuel was coming to meet Saul and would offer a sacrifice to the Lord, which was a traditional way of seeking God's favor and guidance. This was directed to Samuel and Saul. They both knew the plan. The timeline of waiting was specifically within 7 days. But as each day passes, Saul grows more fearful, and the enemy becomes more and more imminent. And on the 7th day, Saul makes the sacrifice himself. He says, you know what, I just got to do it. I just got to do it. And at that moment, he makes the sacrifice himself. Samuel arrives. Samuel tells him, you've done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of your Lord God. Now your kingdom shall not endure. This was not an empty threat. God originally intended to establish Saul's dynasty, but now that was off the table. When he put the sacrifice on the table, he removed God's promise to him. Saul's authority weakens over time to the point that his reign became unstable. The very things that led Saul to mess this all up and mess up his promised dynasty, they began to fester and grow even more. So what did he do? He became more anxious and more fearful. He lacked even more composure and control, and he gains a reputation as a reactive king. He later falls into this lack of judgment again. An army known as the Amalekites approaches. God gives clear instruction, and yet again, Saul takes matters into his own hands, which leads to God rejecting him as king in Samuel 15:23. Rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft, and stubbornness is as bad as worshiping idols. So because you have rejected the commandment of the Lord, he has rejected you as the king. Saul, Saul, Saul. Oh no. A man like a Saul, isn't he? Too impatient to let God move. It's a dangerous way to live. always needing to be in control, always needing to verify the results, never wanting to get to the part where the waiting hurts. One of the biggest problems with this is that it means we're not relying on God. Instead, we're opting for relying on ourselves. But we can't rely on ourselves. Jesus died on the cross so you didn't have to. We say it all the time. But also, he died on the cross because you wouldn't and couldn't. When perfection died on the cross, it saved everyone. But if one of us was to die on the cross, that's it. We'd die on the cross. Nothing more happens besides a burial. And by the way, this burial isn't over in 3 days. We'd be stuck. Relying on yourself is relying on someone who couldn't defeat the death and the wages of sin that you're committing at that very moment. It is a foolish and reckless decision, and it led Saul to his demise, and it will lead you to yours. I know it's hard when the pressure is high, but you have to wait on God. He is the only answer. He also can do things that you can't. That's one of the main reasons people pray, because they want God to do what they can't. Well, if he can do what we can't, then shouldn't we wait for him to do it on his time? I feel like if you're asking somebody to do something you can't, you ought to wait on them to do it their way on their time. I know there are those of us who want to be actionable, or we want to be involved, but here's a secret. Sometimes the best action is nothing, getting out of the way. And you don't get the right to always be involved. And that's because we couldn't stay in God's will long enough if he let us be involved. If we were involved, we'd argue. We'd suggest. We'd take matters into our own hands. And let me make myself clear, I'm not for a minute saying you do nothing ever. You know, just acting like a Barbie waiting for a kid to move it around, just sitting around in the closet waiting. No, you do have actions you need to take. But when God is telling you what to do and what you want to do doesn't line up with what that plan is, your action is stop yourself from doing anything that God said not to do. No, you need to be active and diligent. What I'm saying is when you have been in a state of prayer and you know what God wants and what he doesn't want, you need to listen to him. A very common Bible story pattern is dire circumstance. A person is told God's will, a person follows God's will, and a miracle happens. That is a formulaic story-building plot in the Bible because it is what we should do. It's there over and over and over again so you can learn from it. This means you must be in conversation with God about your issues. Otherwise, you won't know what he wants. You can't know his will if you ain't talking to him. Saul knew God's will. And he did what he wanted anyways, because he didn't have the discipline to follow God when it got hard. Sometimes in our walk with God, things are going to get scary. That's a big part of Saul's story. Things were scary. He knew what God wanted him to do, but it got too scary for him. And we often ourselves do that kind of thing where we know what God wants, but it's too scary. That's why when we make these panic decisions, we feel so wrong about them. You ever just made a snap decision and then regretted it the moment you did it? That's your spirit talking. That's your spirit saying you done stepped out of the path. Telling you the answers to your problems are not within your hands, they are within God's hands. So yes, maybe there's a pending doctor's report. Maybe you need a financial miracle. There might even be a relationship in the balance, but you must stay strong when things get their worst, because that's where miracles are born. When hard times come and you don't go, that's a beacon to God. But being scared is not the only thing that leads us to these Saul-like moments, because that's not the only thing that drove Saul. Saul was scared, but he was also a control freak. Uh-oh. There were some people listening to the first part. Well, I'm not like King Saul because I don't be getting scared like that. And some of them just got a shiver up their spine when I said control freak. Yes, some of us can't stay in God's will because deep down we want our will. You get a problem and you try to control the outcome. It doesn't work out, so you start praying. Then you wait on God. And as the moments get closer, you put your hands back into the situation, step out of God's will, things fail, and then you blame God for it. That is an unfortunate control freak pattern. You get your hands back in the situation because you don't like how it's going, and then when it fails, you say, God, what happened? You happened. There are a lot of people who ain't in these pews right now because they're mad at God, even though they're the ones that stepped out of his will, and they didn't like the outcome that they made happen. That is happening across churches all over the place. There are people who prayed and prayed and prayed, and God's will was something they didn't want. And when they didn't like the results of what God was saying, they started making moves themselves. And then things failed. And they said, well, God let me down. No. You let you down. When we act like that, we are being unreasonable, and it's making no sense. How can you say to God, I can't figure this out, I need you, but then tell him what to do? If you knew what to do, you wouldn't pray about it. Let's be honest. A lot of times people wouldn't pray if they knew what to do. You don't pray for help for putting your gas in your car because you know how to put gas in your car. But when problems come that you can't resolve, you start to get to a place of prayer. But you forget that as the time comes for the resolution of God to happen because you don't like it. Because the resolution of God sometimes isn't pretty. It isn't clean. He arrives on his time, not on your time. And that's another problem with the control freak faith. The control freak Christians wait far too long to get into God's will. They wait way too long to pray. They communicate only after their own failures, like God is a final bullet in the chamber. So listen up. If you relate to a control freak Christian, you need God's will, even for the things you feel are going good. Because if it's not God's will, it's not good. You need to pray because God is not just someone you call when times are tough. You should regularly communicate with the Creator. And when you put your hands back in the pot, they are dirty and it messes things up. You know, the reason we have a cookie jar at the house, the reason we don't want the kids digging in the cookie jar is because kids' hands are gross. Let me get the cookies. The way you take over these moments and then blame God when it fails is like reaching over and yanking your Uber steering wheel and then later on leaving a 1-star review because they got in a wreck. It was on you. They wrecked the car because your hands were on the wheel when they didn't need to be. Your answers didn't work out the way you wanted because you grabbed the wheel and steered yourself right out of his will. And I tell people all the time, you are 50 years old. I'm speaking of random age. You're 50 years old, and you've done it your way for this whole time. And look how that turned out. Why would you spend what's left getting the same results if you ain't liking them anyways? We do this. I'm 34 years old. I'm on my way to 35. I've been an adult for 17 years-ish. And for 17 years, I've been making plans. I've been doing things. And if I don't like the results of what's going on with things I'm in control of, why would I spend what time I have left controlling things? It didn't work out the way I wanted. It's time for me to learn a lesson and go, okay, well, maybe I just give God everything. Because anything I touch doesn't go to anything. It doesn't amount to anything. But everything that God has touched in my life has been beautiful, wonderful, and blessed. So why wouldn't I give him everything? Even the things I think I can control. Because the truth is, sometimes there are things you can control. Sometimes there are situations that you can traverse. But you are not meant to traverse your situations by yourself. There is someone ahead of you making a path. You aren't the path maker. You are the path follower. And that means every decision has to be verified and dictated by the Father. Saul couldn't contain himself. He was king, and he was used to being the final say. The end-all, be-all, the choice maker. It ends with me. He couldn't stand playing a role in a situation. So he stepped out of God's will, and then he tried to defend it. Funnily enough, the king was denying the King of Kings. And being a king himself, you would think Saul should understand that kind of authority. He got results. Bad ones. He ruined God's true will for him, which was to make his reign significant and solidified. So Saul's anxiety and control freak mindset ruined his story. Ruined his miracle. There was a story being told, and Saul interrupted. I visualize it like those concerts, like the Super Bowl, like Michael Jackson is standing there waiting while the crowd is going crazy for anticipation for the performance of a lifetime to start. You hear the bass line, you know exactly what's going to happen. And right as Michael Jackson reaches out for the mic, someone runs from off the stage and grabs it and starts singing. And it's not even the right song. Saul is what happens when you feel the heat and give up. But what does the opposite of that look like? Because that's who you should emulate. If you are someone who's feeling the heat, some of y'all experienced Christians might know what I'm about to say. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were told to stop worshiping the Lord. So what did? They chose the King of Kings over the king in front of them. And that brought them to a dire situation. They were shown a furnace of great heat, so hot that it killed one of the soldiers who prepped it for them. They were told to stop praising God or be thrown in. They felt figurative and literal heat. And they said, nah, we're going to keep praising God. And then they were thrown in. You see, some people think that their situation should work out like after you deny the hardship, after you say, you know what, I'm going to stick with you, God, that's the moment where God would stick into the story. If they wrote the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego story, there wouldn't be a fourth man in the fire because they wouldn't have got in the fire. And the miracle wouldn't have been as big because they would have stopped one little tiny thing. And they're stepping in the way of the fourth man in the fire, in the furnace. And did they die? Nope. There was a fourth man in the fire. And he was there to keep them safe. That was the true miracle. You see, they might have not been able to fathom the fourth man in the fire. It probably wasn't in their mind at all. They were willing to die. When you read that story, they were willing to walk into the furnace and die for the Lord. And God said, that's not the plans I have for you. I'm going to make you go through this, and you're going to stand the test of the fire. So maybe sometimes when the heat is on you, it's because you're meant to get in the heat. Maybe your miracle is on the other side of the furnace. And maybe we ain't getting the miracles we want because we won't step into the chambers of the furnace because we're worried about getting burned. Because we think God is big enough to say to the king to change his mind. But we don't think God is big enough to stop the fire from burning us. Let me tell you today, God is big enough to do anything at any time, at every time. And when you rely on him, you can find yourself a fourth man in your fire. But you'll never find a fourth man if you aren't in the fire. See, they made it through the fire and flames because they were dragged into this situation and their faith forced a move of God. When they were released from the fire, the king said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego," and declared that no one shall speak against their God. And he promoted them into elevated roles and placed them in the kingdom of Babylon. Their faith, when things got hard, made something big happen. I want to look at some key parts of their story. They had no direct moment where God said, hey, do this and you'll be safe. They just had faith to go on, discipline to go on. So you have Saul, who had directive from God and couldn't follow it. And you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who just had the love of God in their hearts. They knew what God's will was going to be like. They praised God. They were in communion with God. They knew God, so they knew God would want me to get in that fire. That's a clue for the type of relationship you need to have. Is the kind of relationship that doesn't need a directive from God. You just understand what his will would sound like. They even said, if we die, we're still going to praise. That's the kind of faith we need to have. If I don't make it through this situation, I'm going to praise. If the doctor's report does say I have cancer, I'm going to praise. If the bank comes for the car, I'm going to praise. If this relationship falls apart, I'm going to praise. Because no matter how hard the circumstance looks, no matter how hot the flames get, the hand of God will reach out and cover me. Even if this miracle doesn't happen, God is still real and still good. They were more concerned with God's will than even their own life. Because God's will is made plain to us in Jeremiah 29:11. That's why it's a great example. For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. That's God's will for you. So if you're sitting in a hospital bed and you think God's will is for me to suffer, no, it's not. That suffering might be a part of your greater story. That suffering might be the genesis of your miracle, but he is going to deliver you through it some way. The three men here were not elevated until they stayed in God's will. So you have a king who had a directive from God and couldn't follow it, and then three commoners who only had the love of God who were elevated after that. Maybe your answer is on the other side of that furnace, but you got to get it in. You got to go into the flames. You got to walk in there to make it out. Maybe you haven't made it through this situation you're in because you haven't allowed yourself to really get into it. I am truly touched by how these men were not planned to have impact. They were not directed. There was no prophecy saying these three men will get in the fire, and when they get in, there'll be a fourth man. There's no prophecy for them. But do you know why they had that happen? They got elevated because when they had the chance to act like Saul, they didn't. They stayed firm in their faith, firm in their belief, and when the heat hit them, they stayed true to God. For a moment with me, close your eyes and picture that struggle you've been going through. Oh, I know we got one. That unanswered question. The prayer and waiting. The miracle that's not yet here. There's a fork in your road. The heat is up. Do you choose Saul or do you choose the three men in the furnace? God's will or yours? God's result or yours? Let's open our eyes and continue this sermon. I'm blessed because I also want us to know about another person. Saul's not the only example I want to talk about today. Let's talk about, and I've looked online, there's Uzzah and Uzzah. And I'm going to go with Uzzah because Uzzah sounds like I'm from Boston. So Uzzah, his story begins with the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was the most prized item in Israel. It represented God's throne and his presence amongst his people. God gave clear instructions on how to handle it so that it would not be treated casually. Those being, only the Levites were allowed to transport it. It had to be carried on poles inserted through rings that were on the sides. No one was ever to touch the ark itself directly so that they will not die. The Levites had to prepare themselves to even approach it. That brings us to Uzzah and his part in the family that was entrusted with the ark for a time. That meant he grew up around the ark, got familiar with it. King David would eventually want the ark brought to Jerusalem. Uzzah and his brother, Ahio, were chosen to guide the cart, to carry it. And that's where the problems begin. They didn't put it on poles. Instead, they placed it on a new cart. And that new cart was modeled after how the Philistine army transported it after they captured it. The cart was efficient, and it looked very reverent to the ark. That's the truth. It was probably, in terms of just looking at it from man's perspective, it probably was a much more efficient way to transport it. It probably would not tire out soldiers and men. It probably seemed more secure. And it being on a cart made it seem like this big, wonderful item rather than something dragged on some poles. But it wasn't God's instruction, was it? They moved forward this way. And as they grew closer to Jerusalem, they began to party with music and instruments. At that point, the oxen carrying the cart stumbled, and the ark shifted, and in that moment, Uzzah reached out to steady the ark, and he touched it. And in that moment, he died. He was killed for touching the ark. Even King David couldn't fully grasp this. It seemed harsh, but it wasn't. Because here's a hard truth that you need to know through this story for your situation. Sincerity is not an excuse for disobeying God. Uzzah thought that God needed his help. That's where the problem started. But truthfully, if he would have taken God's help through the instruction and how to transport the ark, it would have never stumbled. The reason it's on poles is because it's a much more secure thing than a cart. I can't imagine how the roads would be, but Brooks and Dunn have a great song called Red Dirt Road, and in the music video, the car is rumbling as it drives. And I imagine the roads in the Middle East at the time were much worse and much more bumpy than our roads are. So I can't imagine the ark looked great on that thing. They thought it looked reverent, but I'm imagining it bouncing around a lot. And as the oxen stumbles, he just reaches out. It's a flash instinct. If you've ever been in the kitchen and something drops, you grab it, don't you? We all have that instinct. Uzzah was given clear directive from God, but did something different because he thought it was more efficient and it brought more honor. But in truth, his ways brought death. God's ways brought the Ark of the Covenant to where it belongs. Uzzah's ways, the ways of men, bring death. They might look right. They might look good. It might look like the right thing to do. And the people around were thinking, well, he was only making sure that it wouldn't fall, as if God was going to let the Ark of the Covenant fall. As if they're the ones who ever delivered it to them in the first place. They didn't even have any part to play in the things that were inside the ark itself. The ark was filled with items like the 10 Commandments and Aaron's staff. Those were things that they had nothing to do with, and it's filled with those things. And then God made the Ark of the Covenant. It was captured and recaptured and brought through all these places. This story of how it got to them makes no sense from man's perspective because God was directing it. And yet these men thought, God needs my help. Ain't that us? Ain't that us? That's how we get when our hard times come. We just start doing stuff. Can't sit still, so we start just making things happen. Some people even they know God wants them to wait. God said, hey, I'm going to have something happen for you this Tuesday. Or just trust me, it's going to happen. And on Monday, they're still writing backup plans. Okay, I'm not doing anything, God, but I'm writing these backup plans just in case. We step out of instruction, and then later we touch the ark. You see, we have these moments where God doesn't want us to do something, and we step out of instruction and we touch our ark, the thing we're not allowed to touch. Uzzah wasn't like Saul because I'd say he didn't have clear ill intent when touching the ark. He didn't obey God when the stumbling happened. He panicked. But his intent wasn't evil or wrong or to just straight up deny God. Saul was thinking in that moment, I have to do something about this. Uzzah was an instinct. But disobedience is disobedience. That's the end and the short of it. It really boils down to Uzzah thought that he needed to save the ark as if God hadn't saved it multiple times before. He operated on instinct instead of faith. There it is. There it is right there. Operating on instinct instead of faith. You get a bill that's due and you don't have enough, so you pray and God says, trust in me. Well, the day before the due date comes, you feel your ark kind of falling, so you panic. And you call and set up a payment arrangement. Instinct over obedience right there. And listen, payment arrangements aren't inherently bad. I had kids at 20. I've been on a few of myself. They're not inherently bad, but the problem is if you've been told before by God to just trust in him, and then after that you choose something else, that thing is wrong no matter what it is. It's not that trying to stop the ark from falling was inherently bad. It's that he was told a certain list of things to do and he didn't follow them, and one of those things was to never touch it. And it even goes so far as to say, so that you may not die. So he told him not to do it, and even this time went so far as to say, yeah, this is because you'll die. Kind of like when we tell children don't touch the stove because it's hot. Sometimes we don't give kids instructions. We with like clear answers. We say, don't do this because I said so. This wasn't a because I said so. This was, you are in danger if you do this. And yet, through his instincts and not his faith, he acted. And Uzzah died. He was just scared. And that led him to action. But that action resulted in disobeying God directly. As Christians, here's a clue. Your instinct needs to be obedience. And if it's not, then you don't need to act on your instincts. Okay? If your instinct isn't to do what God wants, if your instinct isn't obedience to the Father, don't act on your instincts. Okay? People say act on your instincts like we're animals. We're not. We're above the animals. We have other things like the Spirit and guidance from the Lord. That's what you rely on. Okay, you're not some lion chasing a gazelle down the road. You've got bigger plans. We must discipline ourselves to not jump into action so we don't get in God's way. We have to be practiced in learning that no matter how bad it looks, God is in control. Uzzah jumped into action because he thought himself the Savior. I'll stop this. Yeah. Not God. That's what he thought. The ark was housed by Uzzah's family, but God was who protected it. Are you getting this? You are the one living your life, but God is the one protecting it. Let me say that again. You are the one living your life, but God is the one protecting it. We're just like Uzzah sometimes. We don't mean harm. We think we're helping. We think we're doing the right thing, but all that is wrong because intent doesn't erase disobedience. And deep down, it boils down to this. I lacked faith, and because I did, I made these decisions. That's why it's wrong. So no, it's not harmless. It's indicative of a part of your life where you don't trust God, and that is harmful. Uzzah believed that God would let the ark fall. That's a problem. That's a problem. And you believe that God will let you fall. That's a problem. Either way, you're believing that the hands of God have cracks. We're held in the hands of the Father. And some of us think he holds us like this with a bunch of cracks in the middle. I assure you, you are safe in the hands of the Lord. There are no cracks, no dips, no chances of falling. You just have to stay in there. And so often we're in the hands of the Lord and we jump out of it. And as we're falling, we go, hey, drop me. When we talked about Saul, we countered that with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, for this story, we're going to counter that with learning about Joseph. No, not your handsome, athletic pastor. But the Joseph with a colorful coat and a dream. So let's tell a story. Joseph was the youngest of a dozen boys. Aren't you glad I'm not the youngest of a dozen? And his elder brothers were often jealous and less than kind to him. He had a gift of prophetic dreams, and one of those dreams was God's promise that one day he'd be elevated to a position of power and his brothers would bow down to him. Oh, they didn't like that. They didn't like that. That, coupled with the father's gift of a colorful coat, enraged the brothers to the point that they sold him into slavery. That slavery lasted for 13 tumultuous years, full of hardship and heartache. The man he served was named Potiphar, who was an officer of the Pharaoh. And I want to go back to 13 years there. Think about that, 13 years. So many times we hear this story and people think that he was a slave for a few days, a year, maybe two. No, this is over a decade of hardship. Think about that. Potiphar's wife took a liking to Joseph and would make sexual advances towards him. And after multiple denials, she falsely accused him of assault. And this landed Joseph in prison. Let's pause right there. One day you will be elevated to a position of power. Slavery and then prison. Wow. Follow that trail line. When would we jump off the train, right? When would we jump off the train? In prison, Joseph continues his work of God interpreting dreams, a skill that eventually drew the attention of Pharaoh himself. He is eventually ushered into Pharaoh's presence, where he interprets his dreams, which ultimately helps save Egypt. As a reward, Pharaoh makes Joseph his second in command. There he oversees 7 years of abundance and has 2 sons, followed by 7 years of famine, which leads Joseph's brothers to come to the leaders for aid. Unbeknownst to them, the leader whom they seek aid from is the very brother they sold. After they show regret for their actions, he reveals his identity to them, and he forgives them. Pharaoh offers them the help they need, and Joseph is reunited with his father after 22 years. Joseph serves as the second most powerful man in Egypt for 80 years. Throughout this story, Joseph had plenty of moments to act like Uzzah and panic, but he didn't. He had a promise from God, and he trusted that it would come to pass. Even after consistent hardship, he waited over a decade for the fulfillment of God's promise. Imagine you prayed right now for healing, and God said, I got you in 12 years. Even if you had that kind of directive, you would lose faith probably. But he didn't even have a timeline. God just gave him a dream that he interpreted, meaning that he would one day be elevated into a role. And he kept believing in that dream from a prison cell, from slavery, from hardship, from false accusations. He just kept believing. And it wasn't a good decade either. Let's just make that clear. It wasn't like a decade of waiting in the fields and frolicking. No, he was a slave and a prisoner. And if I'm starting with a couple of things I don't want to be, those will probably be top of the list. A decade of hardship and pain. Joseph pressed on. He continued onward in belief. Sold into slavery? Belief. Falsely accused? Belief. Years of famine? Belief. And here's a part of the story that I didn't plan to say, but let's look at something. When he was sold into slavery, Potiphar's wife came after him, and instead of choosing the amoral, ungodlike thing, he stayed true to what God would want and did the right thing. And then when that false accusation happened and he ended up in prison, instead of moping and kicking rocks and acting like a baby in prison, he just kept doing the Lord's work. There's a clue of what to do. It's not just about waiting in belief. There's going to be opportunities while you wait, while you're going through hardship, to choose the godlike things. Wow. The story of Joseph sometimes gets boiled down to somebody who just kept believing. But let's not forget, he just kept choosing God. More than just belief, he chose God. And do you know what that brought him? Abundance beyond that which he was promised. When he thought he would be elevated and his brothers bowed down to him, I don't think he thought he'd be second in command of all of Egypt. I don't think so. I think he thought, maybe I'll be the mayor, you know? Maybe I'll be the local mayor, or actually, I might even be like a sheriff or something. That'd be cool. He wasn't thinking second in command. He wasn't thinking sitting next to Pharaoh. And when his brothers bowed down to him, I don't think he even thought that would later result in his family's abundance. God made a promise to Joseph, and he believed in it, but he didn't even know how good the promise was. Joseph's instinct was to trust God. So he acted in a way that indicated that. I'm going to be a royal someday. Sold into slavery. Okay, this may be the opposite of royalty, but God is still God. I interpret dreams. Well, now I'm in prison. Well, people sleep here, and sleeping people have dreams. Do you see, given every chance to abandon things, he stayed firm. The story keeps looking like confirmation that God's promise wasn't real, but Joseph saw beyond that. He knew that God is the authority, not the moment. That's right, amen. Circumstances don't dictate God. God dictates circumstances. He could have been in the prison cell and thought, well, God failed, but he knew something deeper happened, so he kept interpreting dreams. And the spirit within him that followed the Lord said to him in his head, if I just keep believing, if I just keep doing the right things, I'll just keep being Joseph who follows God. Amen. And what happened? God dictated the circumstances, didn't he? Amen. It doesn't make any sense. When you think about the fact that he was interpreting dreams of other prisoners, and then that got to the jailers. And then that got to the warden. And then that got to other people. Eventually getting all the way to Pharaoh doesn't make sense. It doesn't. People tell the story like that's an easy trail line. It doesn't make any sense at all. Yeah. If I'm arrested in Austin right now and I start interpreting dreams, it'll be 15 years, 38 years before Greg Abbott hears about me. if he ever does. It doesn't make sense because God dictated something for him. And Joseph just did the right things until God did his thing. Uzzah, the man who died from a panic decision that led him to disobey God. Or Joseph. Ooh, Joseph. The one who could trust the process. The one who was instinctually obedient, whose faith led him into the promised blessings of God. Who do you want to be? Let me close with this. You arrived here today with a conflict, a circumstance that needs answers. And maybe God is answering it in a way that's testing your resolve. That's okay. You're not meant to be perfect. Sometimes you'll get afraid. Sometimes you'll be shaken by your circumstances. That's okay. You can be Saul and grow impatient and desire control. Or you could be Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and trust God. You could be Uzzah and panic. Or you could be Joseph and trust the process. Uzzah and Saul are both anxious and think they should do something about it. Joseph and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are faithful and trust God wholly that he will do something about it. That's the true breaking point in their stories, and it will be the breaking point in yours. Success for you is based on how much you can trust God. And under what circumstances can you still find resolve? So I am opening up the altars of prayer, and we shall pray together for God's move. And we're going to commit to trusting that move. No matter what it looks like, the outcome of God outweighs the journey to get there. Yes, the story of Joseph being sold into slavery and then being falsely accused, you know, if you make that a movie and you stop it there, it's a decent movie. It's a masterpiece when God shows up. It's a masterpiece when God shows up. And Dad, if you don't mind, on the back I've got a playlist ready to go. You could just hit play. I'm going to play a song that inspired this sermon. And in this song, there are some lyrics that ring true today. There will be joy in the morning. Yes, you might be in the night times now, but dark circumstances may be difficult. There is joy in the morning. And the other lyric that I love is, if it's not good, then he's not done with it yet. Ooh, let that sit in your spirit. If it's not good, then he is not done with it yet. God's outcome is always good because God is always good. So come forth today knowing to pray that there will be joy in the morning. And when times get hard, remind yourself, if it's not good, then he's not done yet.